Thank you. Welcome to the Dr. Rima Truth I'm Rima E. Labo, MD. I am the Medical Director of the Natural Solutions Foundation, and you are listening to the Dr. Rima Truth Reports here on peopleforpeople.ning.com, a station that has amazing hosts and guests. And today, my co-host and co-trustee of the foundation, Ralph Fusatola, will be joining me a few minutes late. My guest is G, as he's known, and he is leading the parade, so to speak, to protect us from being by pulsed microwave technology, known familiarly as 5G. And Paul is not just somebody who's talking about making change. He's somebody out there in the trenches. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us how you got into this muddled mess of a brouhaha around 5G energy and small cell towers and so on. And then tell us what the situation is now and how to protect ourselves.
Okay, well, listen, thank you very much for inviting me onto your program. I am very much in awe of what you've been doing over the past 30 years, so I'm very happy that our paths are crossed. I was aware of you before, but now that we are connected, I can see that you're quite a great person to be connected with in this time, and we need to work together to figure out ways to save everybody from, a predictably bad outcome. So the first thing I have to mention to everybody is it doesn't really matter about the G's. Okay, that's one reason I'm called. So the idea is listen to what I have to say and then stop talking about the G's, because it's about the power. And it doesn't really matter what the frequency is. It doesn't matter what the G is. And they use these marketing terms to confuse everybody. And so the whole idea is just understand wherever you are, there is a license that some company has purchased from your government in order to transmit frequencies. And then they're doing everything they can to up the power on the little bit of slice of bandwidth they have on those frequencies. Well, this used to be fairly reasonable. And wavelength are exactly how you describe the electromagnetic spectrum. And when you multiply the two things together, they equal the speed of light. That means that they have a reciprocal relationship. As your frequency goes up, your wavelength goes down. Think of wavelength as just the ocean waves. You kind of see these pulsations on the ocean, and you can see at the top of a wave to another top of a wave. When you measure the distance there, that's your wavelength. Frequency is how many times a second it goes by. And so, for electricity, it's fairly slow, 50 times a second or 60 times a second. For telecommunications, it's quite fast. 700 megahertz, that's what they call it. And if you had 2.4 billion times a second, that's 2,400 megahertz, that would be like Wi-Fi. So when you do that, then you have to think about the corresponding wavelengths. All right, it's 700 megahertz, which is kind of the low end of 4G. It's maybe something like a 17-inch wave. And then when you're at Wi-Fi, you're more like a 5-inch wave. And what they're doing now is they're trying to open up and get all kinds of extra frequencies with much smaller wavelengths and pumping a whole bunch of power on them. And the problem is every single one of them is biologically active. And you have to be very careful about how much total power they're putting out there. I got involved in this back in 2013, just trying to save my daughter from getting poisoned in her classroom. And essentially, we had to homeschool because they wouldn't actually give us what we wanted. What were we asking for? Choice. We were asking for one elementary school, one middle school, and one high school without wireless, just with wired networking. That's what we pushed for. They wouldn't have any of it. They forced us out of the school district. We're homeschooling as a result. But I've gotten involved at the state level on some bad bills. We've gotten some veto of some of these bad bills, and we've gotten some movement at the federal level. But, it's a big challenge to try to fight off all this industry that really, really wants to come into your public rights of way and put in full power cell towers right there, right in front of your house. It's bad call.
Now, why does industry care about doing this?
They just want to make money. That's pretty much it. So they just look at it as, what do I have to do to spend money in order to make money? You have to understand that wireless networking is one of the most profitable industries. I mean, everybody has a cell phone for the most part. It takes a pretty dedicated person not to order a cell phone plan because they are very convenient and good in emergencies. And that's what the whole thing was set up to do. It was to actually have an emergency call network for yourself when you're out and about. And that was its purpose. And that's what all the laws and all the case law is all about. This whole idea of wireless broadband is not covered by the laws, but it makes them more money. So they're trying to sell you on the idea of wireless broadband. So that's what they're doing, is they're grabbing more frequency bandwidth. So on a number of frequencies, they try a larger bandwidth with more power to send you more data, and then they charge you for every bit of data. If you got this through a wire, you wouldn't be capped like that, and you would get a lot more data, and you would end up being a much more economical. They want to try to extract as much money as they can from you.
You say it's not covered by the law.
Correct.
What does that mean? Here I am, a citizen. I have a house. I have a cell phone. I think that the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and the state equivalent thereof is looking out for my best interests, and you say it's not covered by the law. What does that mean?
Okay, so you have to understand the relationship between laws that are passed by your elected representatives and regulations that are then written in order to implement the law. And that's done by a separate branch of government called the federal agency, or potentially even your state agency could get involved. Okay, so really, if you have to go back a little bit and say, well, when did this cell phone stuff kind of get started? Well, it kind of got started in the mid 80s. And so there was a little bit of how are we going to get it done, early startup costs, not too many towers, and they weren't quite sure how to do it. And they also weren't quite sure whether or not this was going to be safe enough to do. And so they went out and they did some research to figure out what was going on, and did the initial cell phones actually hurt people? Well, in fact, they did. And then they tried to do everything they could to bury that information and game the science and figure out a way to write a law to still allow them to make money and skirt this issue. But they knew about it from day one. They knew there was always a problem when you put microwave radiation up close and personal to people. Where did they first learn this? Well, it was all in World War II. And it all happened with radar. We basically won the war based on radar. And what do? We figured out a way to send out microwave radiation and bounce it off maybe a metal ship or a metal submarine, and then send it back to a receiver so we could figure out where the location of something was. Well, on the other side, the Germans were noticing that we were blowing up their submarines whenever they came up to the surface. So they leaned on a guy named Hermann Schwann, who was a PhD, and he figured out a way to put a fabric on those submarines in order to no longer bounce the signal back to the planes. And so we now weren't able to track the submarines as well. Well, that was an important event in the wartime. What was happening to the poor sailors running the radars on the ship? Well, there was no safety. There was no idea of how much is too much. They were standing by these big receiving antennas and finding out that their chocolate bars were melting in their pockets. Well, that was a little too much energy. So a lot of these people got sick and died right there on the ships from microwave radiation exposures. But there was no guideline. So they just put them in a box and shipped them home, and they tried to keep it quiet. Well, the war stopped. We had the paperclip program. We saved all those bright minds in the Nazi world, and we brought them over to the United States. And one of the people we brought over was Hermann P. Schwann, the guy that made that fabric. And they leaned on him in 1953 and asked him for what his idea it would be for such a guideline. Well, who leaned on him? The U.S. Navy. They're the ones that sponsored him from 1947 all the way up through 1983. He was at the University of Pennsylvania that whole time. He would do whatever the Navy wanted. He was the guy that dreamed up the first guideline. And it was a guess. That's all it was. The guy really had no basis for making the guess. He just made a guess. And it was supported by 4 total people, all military and Herman. That's where it came from. 1953 meeting, 4 people. And so they guessed at 100 million microwatts per square meter. And that's what they did. And that's when they eventually ran with that for a while. And then they cut that down by 10 to 10 million. So I was saying, wait,
what? They made a guess without doing any research, or they did some research and made a guess?
No research at that point. They just made a guess.
Okay.
This is rolling out of World War II. So they just looked at, well, how are things running? What do you think could be just sustained by people in a working environment? So he made this guess out of the blue. And they started running with it, and they still found that people were having problems and the rest. So then eventually they started doing some research into it, and so the Navy was very interested in it. And Zurich Glaser was a Navy medical person at that time, and he had a whole big database of it, and he retired with it. And nobody was interested in retaining it. So he put it in a storage bin, and then eventually Magda Havas from Canada hooked up with the guy and took possession of it. And so she's got a great treasure trove of all the research they did through the late 50s, 60s, and 70s to actually figure out what happens when you do have microwave radiation next to people. None of it's good.
Now we have cell towers, small cell towers, and I wonder if you could talk about what a small cell tower is, because it sounds like it's an itty-bitty nothing of a thing, and that's not quite the case. So now we have small cell towers feeding broadband microwave transmissions pretty much everywhere. And what's the battle? What's the issue, and what are we doing about that?
Well, I guess that's the good thing now, to figure out what did they try to do to make this industry happen, because it's all in the foundations of how they got the permission to do what they're doing today. And so they knew that they had to do something to set some kind of national standard. Otherwise, they were not going to be able to build out their network. So you do have to go back to now, after they started making a commercial event of trying to sell the early cell phones. We all know they were kind of like bricks, right? And some of them required you to carry around a suitcase the early days. And then they installed them in your car. And actually, that was a pretty good solution, because in the car, what would happen is that the antenna would be on the roof. And then you would have a metal shield, the roof of your car, shielding you from the receiving of that radio frequency signal. Then it would follow by wire down to the unit that would be on the console, and then you would talk about it basically with a curlicue cord and just regular headset. That was a decent cell phone. They should return to that. That would be a good way to do it. What's happened now is they just made things smaller and smaller and smaller in size, but not in power. They've actually made it larger and larger and larger in power. So you're confused by size equaling power. That's not true. It turns out that that thing that's outside your house in the public rights of way, because of the distance closer to you, is thousands of times more powerful than one of those large towers. Well, how could that be? It's all about three variables. You can't actually assess any cell tower of any size or any G until you understand three parameters, and you have to regulate them and think about them all at once. They are simply vertical, horizontal, power. Vertical, horizontal, power. If you haven't regulated all three, you have achieved nothing. Well, why is that? Well, the point is that vertical is how many feet off the ground is that antenna? Hey, is it better for that antenna to be 200 feet off the ground or 30 feet off the ground? Well, from a human being standpoint, y'all want it higher. Higher is better. Okay, why? Because people don't really live 200 feet off the ground. Vertical offset is important. Horizontal offset, how far is the tower from you? Well, that matters too, because this signal will actually fall off by the square of the distance. All right, so if you go 10 times in distance, okay, 10 times it down. Goes, okay, 100 times lower. And then you go to 1,000 times, that's 10,000 times lower. All right, so but the same thing happens in reverse. As they get closer, it increases by the square of the distance. So the point is, the worst place to put a cell tower is on the pole in front of your house. That's the worst place.
And guess where the permit that was issued by the city of Tucson for the cell tower that is up close and personal to me is intended to be? It's 20 feet from my house. And how many feet off the ground is it? The tower is less than 34 feet tall. I don't know what they're intending to do because we've stopped the construction thus far. There is no tower at the moment. We stopped them in June. The permit expired on August 1st, not August 31st. I was wrong about that. And we don't know whether another permit has been issued or not. And the people who are in charge of giving out those permits are refusing to discuss that with us.
Refusing to discuss.
Yes. And they said what we should do is institute a Freedom of Information Act to find out whether my house is going to be the site of a less than 34-foot tower. The reason they call it a small cell tower, wireless tower, is because the pole is less than 34 feet. As Paul just said, vertical is important. I'd be safer if the pole were 2,000 feet tall, but they don't seem to want to do that. So
none of them get to be 2,000 feet. That would be a nightmare for all the things that fly around in the sky. But they are, a lot of them, between 200 and 400 feet. And there's a real advantage for being just under 200 feet. There are a lot of them out there at 199 feet. Well, why is that? Well, now it's optional to actually register your tower with the FCC. You see, if you're 200 feet and over, the FCC knows where you are. If you're lower than that, if you're 199 feet, well, then you never have to register with the FCC, and they have no idea where these towers are. And that's the way the companies like it.
There were two court cases, one not so recent, one very recent, that might be giving us the advantage to get control of this situation. And I wonder if you think it would be timely to talk about that, Paul.
I will do that just as I tell you first about the 1996 Telecommunications Act.
Please.
Because that sets the foundation, and then you can see what's happened is over the years, the FCC has tried to write regulations that illegally tried to extend the Telecommunications Act. The point is the Telecommunications Act actually does a fairly good job of balancing the needs of a national program and a desire that we needed to have something versus local control. And they did a good job of striking a balance there before that law went into effect. A lot of people criticize the 1996 TCA, but they don't really understand that they wanted to build this industry, but they were starting to do the research, and they actually hired a guy named Dr. George Carlo. Now, Carlo was an industry guy already for some other industries, and he pretty much oversaw research that was friendly to the industry. So the wireless industry thought that guy was safe. Let's go hire him. So here you go. We, as the wireless industry, are going to give you $25 million, and we're going to go ahead and have you parse out that money and get a bunch of scientists out there to start doing research and tell us whether there's a problem or not with this cell phone stuff. Because some people are coming in saying they're dying of brain tumors. We already got a couple lawsuits going, so it doesn't sound good. We need some research that's going to help us build our industry. So they depended on him to deliver. Well, he went out and put the money out, and he got the results back. Turns out the results weren't as they expected. Turns out that there are real problems. And he reported this to the wireless industry. What was their response? Bury it. They got rid of him, pushed him out, had no more research program, and then worked on our elected representatives to pass the 1996 Telecommunications Act, because it was a race now between the science getting out in the public and them getting protection from an act. And what did they want to do? Well, the wireless industry wish list was to say, you know what, we got this FCC, we can pretty much control those guys. Why don't we actually run the whole thing through them? They will decide where the towers get built. They will all be up to them. No local control whatsoever. That was the initial idea. And that was all part of the House Bill 1555. And that was all set to be part of law in the fall of 1995. But they got to the Senate version, and the senators at the time, including Senator Markey, who's still there 25 years ago, what this was, he basically led the movement to say, hold on. You got to balance the needs of locals and this national program. We do need a nationwide wireless program, but we have to allow the locals to figure out how to implement it. So they wrote the law exactly that way. They switched it up. It used to be running top down from the FCC, and it flipped the other way. And it says, look, we're going to preserve all local control except for a few narrow preemptions. All right. And so essentially that's how they wrote it, and they signed it into law. So the point is that the current law, the way it's written, is actually very well written and is enough that we can use in court to defend our houses against these things, as long as you don't have a bad state bill. Here's where the problem is. There's a cooperative federalism settled up by the 1996 Act. It really means that we have some stuff claimed at the federal level, and whatever's not claimed at the federal level falls to the states. The states can claim whatever they need to regulate, and whatever they don't regulate falls to the locals. So you ask yourself, of all the parameters out there, how many are held by each party? Well, for years and years, very little was held by the federal. The state didn't really weigh in, and it was almost all held by the locals. Well, that's the right way to think about this, because a local town can easily say, you know what do we need? We need enough power for telecommunications service, which is a phone call, outdoors. You know, they always talk about in-building coverage. Oh, we have to penetrate deep into buildings to make sure you can make a call in the bathroom. None of that's in the law. Just so we're clear, this whole thing was about making an outdoor emergency phone call. That's all you need. That's all that you need the power for. Well, that's a very low amount of power. So the point is, you can get your whole town covered by, and Andrew Campanelli is the top telecom attorney in the United States that's fighting cell towers, will say this all the time. All you got to do is put one in the junkyard, one in the dump, and one at some kind of electric substation, and you got your whole town covered. You don't need more than 3 cell towers in your entire town, unless you're a huge town. Bottom line is, that is because as you have, again, vertical, horizontal, and power. Okay, if you have a nice tall cell phone tower with a good beefy power supply, then you can send that signal out a good 30 miles and everybody could make a call. So all that worked early on because there weren't that many cell phone subscriptions. But if you see what happened over 20 years, it used to be something like 80%, 20%, right? So if you started in let's say the early 2000s, maybe 20% of the people did primarily cell phone stuff, but everybody pretty much still had a landline. So most of your stuff was done on the landline. Well, over the years, it's kind of shifted the other way. So today, it's probably 80% cell phones because a lot of people start dropping their landlines. And so then only 20% is by the landline. Well, that's important because that's how costs should be shared based on the volume of calls. All right. So what did they want? They wanted to basically sign this law in and say, okay, great. We're going to make sure that we preempt a few small things from you in order to help speed the build out of a network. All right. What are those few small things? Well, it's just about what you have to consider. You have to make this a fair playing field. You can't actually give a benefit to one player over another. Okay, great. That's an idea. What else do we want? Well, we have this problem people have with radio frequency microwave radiation. So we're going to not allow a bunch of small little laws out there to do their own thing. We're going to say that the FCC is in charge of setting up whatever the guideline is. Well, the FCC is not a health agency. They don't know anything about biology. Yet they were the ones that were tasked to somehow do some kind of reasoned decision-making and come up with some guideline. Okay, so they were set up they signed this thing in February of 1996, and by August of 1996, they came back and had selected their guideline. Well, where did that guideline come from? Well, 1953, it was 100 million. In 1965, we cut it down to 10 million. Did we do a bunch of research at that point? No, that already damaged people. Oh yeah, lots of it. It's in the books. Your blood-brain barrier leaks. Your neurological conditions happen. You get early dementia. You get all kinds of bad stuff from whatever the level of the guideline ever was. But hey, because enough people started drumming the same drum and singing the same song, they pretty much kept that guideline from 1965, which was ANSI, American National Standards Institute. So when the FCC decided to pick up the guideline, they said, all right, well, we do have an ANSI guideline out there, and we got a bunch of engineers called the IEEE, And then we got this thing called the NCRP, the National Commission on Radiation Protection. Well, who are those people? Oh, that's a little private NGO off to the side. They get some federal money. Wait a minute. Does anybody elect those people? No. How do they get hired? Will they play ball with the public, or are they going to play ball with industry? That's the second one. So they convened a whole bunch of scientists, and they wrote up a review of all the stuff through 1982. And they published that paper in 1986. And I downloaded it and read every page. It's about 450 pages. And you will see that this is a fairly well-written paper through 16 chapters. And they do a really good job of describing everything and laying out that there's a whole bunch of effects that have nothing to do with the heating of tissue. And so you got to be careful about how you do this. And they said, well, we have to come up with a guideline. So we'll look at specific absorption. What's the total amount you absorb? And we'll look at specific absorption rate, the rate at which you absorb it. And we'll look at both. And we'll kind of compare the two and see which one works. Well, it turns out that they recommended specific absorption. Why? Because this is a poison, and it really matters how much poison you get. So that was the recommendation of the paper. But that's not what happened in the conclusion, because at the end of 16 chapters, all those scientists were dismissed. Goodbye. Then they hired the government guy to come in and write the 17th chapter. And he's the one that picked specific absorption rate. It was a scam. It was a scam from day one. Who knows this? George Carlo. Remember that guy? He was already out of the industry by then. He calls me up in March of 2020. He says, look, you're doing a good job on your website. I just want to tell you how this whole thing went down, and it's fraud. And so he told me exactly how they did it. It was just to beat the Europeans to some kind of spectrum auction to try to get a wires industry going fast. They needed something to pull out of their hat. They pulled out specific absorption rate. It should never be rate. It should always be the total amount of poison. Does it really matter the rate at which you give someone poison? Well, only if you know how long you give it to them. If you never tell them about how long you're giving it to them, well, then it's just nonsense, right? So, Ralph, are you here? Can I hear you speak?
I think I'm here carefully. It's been a really interesting exposition.
Yeah, keep going.
All right, so here you go. Here you go. You have a decision to make, Ralph, today. I'm going to put in your hand imaginary beakers, each one 500 milliliters. You got one in your right hand, one in your left hand. Okay? They're empty. All right, now here's the task. I'm going to put poison in each of them, and you're going to have to decide which one to drink. Okay? But I'm the FCC, and I'm hiding the fact of how long I'm putting the poison in there. So I'm going to tell you that I'm going to put poison into those beakers at the rate of 2 drops per second. That's all the information I gave you. Well, I didn't tell you because my guideline has no concept of time. So I'm just explaining how nonsensical this is. So the point is, now that I gave you the information that I'm putting in 2 drops per second poison in each of those beakers, which one do you want to drink? Can you pick one?
There's no way I can give informed consent to either because I'm not informed.
Okay, good. So now that's the guideline. So now I'm going to give you the rest of the information. On the right hand, it's 2 drops a second for 10 seconds. So you have a smidge of poison. On the left one, you have 2 drops a second for 24 hours. So it's a full glass of poison. Right. Now you got these 2 beakers in your hands. Which one do you want to drink?
Clearly the one with the less poison.
There you go. So what is that one? Well, that's driving past a cell phone tower. See, you had a short exposure as you were driving by. What's the other one? Oh, that's living in front of a cell phone tower. Unless you're unfortunately living in the 2nd or 3rd story. Then you have to drink 5 beakers of poison a day. You see, now the time matters. And we already know this because everybody pays an electrical bill, right? Do you pay for watts of electricity? Well, you don't. You pay for kilowatt hours. Take a look at your bill. What are they doing? Watts times the time that you use it. Watts times what you pay for. Well, that makes perfect sense. So the question is, well, FCC, what is the safe amount of poison that I can get? Oh, well, we're going to give it to you at a certain rate forever. That's what they say. And it's okay. Because they have the false assumption that somehow your body's going to dissipate the poison. Well, it doesn't happen. And so they are loading you up. So I had a question that I had to answer, and I had to ask in 2013 because I had to make a decision about my daughter starting kindergarten. And I was fighting hard to have a classroom without a Wi-Fi router. And I just asked them, my school, can we please do that? And nope, they shoved a Wi-Fi router in right before school started. And I said, okay, great, next card to play. OSHA complaint against my school system. There's too much radio frequency microwave radiation being forced upon the employees, the teachers, as well as the students. So I need to get from OSHA and to answer my question. What's the total amount of radiation that my daughter will get in a 6-hour school day? And so I filed a complaint. It was a good 30, 40-page complaint. They receive it. Oh, they don't want to read it. They don't want to deal with it. They want to dismiss you right away. And I said, hold on, wait a minute. I'm one of these, kind of intellectually honest, nerdy types. So you're going to have to deal with me a little more than that. Tell you what, don't dismiss me yet. Let's actually answer the question first and figure out how to answer that question. And then you can decide to compare me to whatever guideline there is and go ahead and dismiss me if you must. But let's get to the answer. All right, they played ball. So we went through about 2 or 3 weeks of emails back and forth. I had a few ideas. They corrected them. They had a few ideas. I corrected them. And we got to an understanding of what was the best way to look at this number. Well, not surprisingly, it is like I told you before. You have to look at the total amount of poison, which means you have to actually calculate what is the rate times the time. Cool. What do we find out? These things pulse at you. And each pulse has a little duration. And each duration I measured as a peak because I went in and made a measurement professionally with a calibrated instrument. So I had that number. And this is all summarized on electrosensei.com. Electro, SENSEI.com. And if you just go to the RF counter, there's a little animation that shows you how it worked. But what it ended up being? It ended up being that we don't even have the correct unit to answer the question. Just like that electric bill. You can't answer this with watts. You have to answer this with watts times time, which, if in physics, is a joule. So it's just, watt seconds is kind of what we do. Okay, great. So we finally did the calculations. We did it all out based on the assumptions and the measurement and all the rest. And so if you do it in watt seconds, now I'm comparing apples to oranges, right? The guidelines based on watts, I calculated watt seconds. How do the numbers compare? In one 6-hour school day, my daughter would receive 8 times the federal maximum public exposure guideline. In 1 week, she would exceed it 40 times from one wireless router in her classroom, no other wireless devices on. So now if you've got a classroom full of 30 kids doing the same thing, now you've upped that number by a good 30, 40, 50 times. Well, why? Well, that router is, between 10 and 50 feet from kids. Distance matters here. Those wireless devices are right in front of them. And they're talking just like that router is, you see? It's a two-way conversation. So the biggest problem with wireless is the device you're close to. That's the one that's poisoning you the most. But you have a choice over that device. You can turn it on and off as needed. In fact, I don't have any wireless in my devices. I wire them all up. And we don't run any wireless antennas in my house because I'm a little sensitive to it. I react to it. I don't think well. I get headaches. I get heart palpitations. I get all kinds of stuff. I'm sensitive. But that puts me in a category of about 10% of the rest of the population right now. And so, we're getting bigger as the days go longer just because people can't withstand this amount of power. All right. So the bottom line is that we already learned that it's just way too much power. And whatever you can do to turn the power down is what you got to do. Well, who recognized this? The 1934 Telecommunications Act has Section 324. And it says specifically the solution to our problem. It says, in all circumstances, this is a quote right out of the law, in all circumstances, all radio shall use the minimum amount of power necessary to carry out the communication desired, end quote. Right there. And the question is, well, what is the minimum amount of power for a small cell outside, 20 feet outside your house? What would that look like? And what would that size of that antenna be? And how much power would it output? Do we have any way to think about that? Well, we do. It's called a Wi-Fi router. If you take a look at the size of a Wi-Fi router in your house, what does it have? A 4-inch antenna. Okay, how much power can it put out? No more than 0.1 watt. That's capped by the FCC. Well, why do they do that? Well, they want to make sure that it's at least somewhat safe to operate and it doesn't interrupt everything around your neighborhood. It can't be too powerful. Oh, okay, so you're telling me that I have to abide by the FCC's power cap in order to be a good neighbor to my other neighbors. Yes, that's right. And so that pole that's outside my house, that has to be just as good a neighbor to me as I am to my other neighbor. So what if we just reduce the size to the size of a Wi-Fi router and put a 4-inch antenna in instead of a 4-foot antenna? Would that do the job? Well, yes, it would. Problem solved. That's all you need to do to solve your problem in Tucson, Arizona. Is you basically say, all right, doesn't look by state law we're going to be able to keep them out very well, but what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at them and say, you know what? These are tanks in our neighborhood. And there are howitzers and cannons when they are blasting us. What do you say we take it down from a cannon and we make it more like a squirt gun? Let's make it nice and small. Because, you know, right now, that thing they call a, quote, small cell, well, how many feet does it go out before you can no longer get a signal from it in order to make a phone call? Oh, about 5 miles. What? What are they doing that for? They tell me they only need to go down the street a couple hundred feet. What are you doing? Hey, if you put that Wi-Fi router right there on the pole, how many feet would it go down? It'd go about a quarter of a mile or a half a mile. See? You put them every half a mile, a little Wi-Fi router, you're done. That's how you solve the problem. So clearly, that's up to the locals. The locals can set public safety laws that say we can cap the power because that's the way the law is written. Right?
But
no,
you got to let your local politicians have to act, don't they?
Yes, they do.
So with all this information here in Tucson, Arizona, somehow or other, that's not what's being installed. Why is that?
The industry just wants the wild, wild west. They don't want anybody getting their way. They want to put up whatever they can. Here's what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, you know what, we don't really want to do just telecommunications service. That's boring. That's just a bunch of phone calls and texts. There's no sexiness in that. There's no big profit opportunity in that. What we're going to do is we're going to try to go after some of that Comcast or Spectrum Charter market share for the home internet. That's what we'll do. And we want to actually do some wireless video and some other stuff. And we're not going to look at the fact that sending a video wirelessly is maybe 1,000 to 10,000 times less energy efficient than sending it by wire to your house. We're not going to look at that. And we're not going to look at the fact that you can get uncapped data from your cable provider when we can cap you at 2 gigabytes a month. And then if you want more, you got to pay more. So, they like this. I'm an unregulated company. I can soak you for all I want. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make the data scarce. Oh, I need more data. I'll pay more money. I mean, right now, my cell phone plan is $15 per month, 15. I know a lot of people that pay $80 to $100 a month. It's ridiculous. But I mean, people are just falling victims to just bad marketing and bad decisions. But I do have wonderful $50 a month service from my fiber optic to the home service from sonic.net. And for that, I get a telephone line. And I get all the internet I need, and it's a gigabit up and a gigabit down. That's 1,000 megabits per second up and down. It's wonderful. And everybody needs that. We're lucky enough to have it. That means that we don't need any of these wireless antennas in order to do internet. It is the most effective way to do internet. You gave us
information, very important information, about the Telecommunications Act. There have been 2 court cases that give us enormous traction in getting these minimized systems in our homes, in our schools, because our schools are being irradiated with non-ionizing radiation that is doing dreadful damage. But telecommunications companies are not saying, oh, good, now we can stop poisoning you. So tell us about the court cases and tell us about what communities are experiencing and doing.
Well, people are getting sick all over the country right now. I mean, I hear from them because, we reach out and people are fighting like heck just to try to protect their homes. And you do have a right to protect your home. Okay, so you should know what the symptoms are when you first get exposed to one of these antennas 24/7. It's kind of a headache thing. You can't sleep well. Maybe you'll hear a buzzing in your head or something. Those are the first things that happen. But eventually it's leading to essentially dementia. And so there are people who are getting dementia way earlier than they should because it affects your brains. We know all about that. So it's neurological conditions. You might have restless leg syndrome, other things, just twitches that you don't normally have. Well, that's because it keeps bothering your nerves because your nerves are on the surface. But your heart is also electrical. So you might actually, like I had, was heart palpitations from just my own Wi-Fi router. So I actually, in my 50s, went up to the hospital thinking I had a heart attack. Well, no, I was fine. I didn't have any problems. But I finally clued in on the fact that I should turn off my Wi-Fi router, which I did permanently. And boy, life changed for me. So I was very happy to learn that, and I got rid of that. So what are these two cases? Okay, this is the courts are actually on our side here. And so we have the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which when you think about the U.S. Court of Appeals system, it's unusual. You have the Supreme Court at the top. All right. And then they break the country into 13 U.S. courts of appeal. Now, 11 of them are little slices of geography. Like I'm over here in California and you in Tucson, Arizona are part of the Ninth Circuit. Okay. Back in New York, that would be the Second Circuit, and they're all numbers all over the place. But there's two that are not part of this geography. One is like a patent court. And the other one is the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. That's about one rung, or maybe half a rung below the Supreme Court. But why is that? Because they're the ones that are charged with looking at particular laws and particular regulatory actions to find out if they're consistent with the underlying statute or whether they are possibly overreaching, which is what the FCC does, or possibly unconstitutional. And so when they make a determination there, then that affects the entire country, you see. And then once in a while, they get busy and they actually have to ask one of the other circuits to take on one of those types of cases, which means it's a national case that affects the whole country. That happened recently with the Ninth Circuit. The other role that these courts play is that they take lower court decisions and they bubble up. And when they bubble up to finally get the final answer, they get it from the circuit. All right. And so really what happened was in 1996, right after they signed the law, that very next day, there was one uniform law across the country for the 1996 Telecommunications Act. However, a year later, that was no longer true because there were court cases in each of these different 11 geographic circuits, and each one came down with slightly different decisions. So this one law, you think is one law, gets shaped differently in the different courts. And sometimes you have disagreements among these circuits. And so one has an interpretation of what a significant gap in coverage is that's different than this one. And they both work in the geography in which they've been decided. Only if it reaches the Supreme Court and they rule on it will it then be uniform again. So we really have 11 separate 1996 Telecommunications Acts. And that's really important to know because you hear all kinds of city attorneys quote a Second Circuit case, applying it to the Ninth Circuit. Well, hello, it doesn't apply to the Ninth Circuit. That's only for the people over there in New York. We don't have to go along with that bad decision. Our judges are smarter out here in the Ninth Circuit. They said this other thing. And so the point is that these guys grab whatever they can, whatever convenient for them, and they think you don't know the difference. All right. So what happened now is we have two court decisions that came down in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. The first one was started in March of 2018. That was an order, one of the first orders that was written by the FCC to establish small wireless facilities with a specific definition, given it special benefits as a separate class of wireless services. All right. And it came out and said, hey, you know what? These things are so small. It's no big deal. It's like a Wi-Fi router. It's kind of like the size of a pizza box. Don't worry about it. We're not going to have to do environmental review on this, right? So we're just going to ask for an exemption and just like roll it out there. So we don't have to worry about doing any kind of work. Well, that was the ask in the order. And what happens to an order? The FCC puts it out. They say, we have the authority to do this because we have this little 1996 Act, and it's got a particular purpose there. So we're going and doing that. And they published it in March of 2018 and voted it through. Well, it sits for a couple of months in the Federal Register, so by July, it becomes essentially a federal regulation that everybody has to rely upon. So from March to July, we all talked about, and that's how the lawsuits all got filed. And then starting in July, it became a real regulation, but it only lasted about 11 months, so 12 or 13 months, I guess. So it went all the way to the next July. And then finally, we got the ruling. See, the lawsuit happened in February, March of 2019, and the ruling came in August of 2019. Well, the ruling is awesome. I would read it. It's the judges taking the FCC out to the woodshed and slapping them silly, and pretty much said, folks, you didn't do your homework here. No, we're not buying any of your premises here. You want to put out 800,000 to 1 million extra cell phone towers? Yeah, that's a big deal. You called them small? No, not when you look at the power. And you're thinking you're not going to have to do any environmental work? Yeah, that's not going to work either. So tell you what, we're going to take that order and we're going to call it arbitrary and capricious. You didn't do your homework, didn't do your analysis, and we're going to vacate it, meaning it's gone, and we're going to send it back to you, and we're going to ask you to do a better job. Well, guess what was in that order that got remanded, vacated first and then remanded? It was the definition of a small wireless facility. Oh, how about that? The foundational definition got vacated right then. I don't quite understand. So wait a minute. We set up the definition in March of 2018, and then we had some other orders that came in August and September that referenced that definition and gave all these special benefits. Oh, only $300 a month for rent, and oh, it has to have a 60-day shot clock, and all those other things they wanted to add to the benefits of small wireless facilities. Well, in August of 2019, boom, definition's gone. Where are those benefits pointed towards? Anything useful? No. Oh, the FCC is in a pickle now. What's the FCC going to do? They lost their small cell agenda. They lost their little foundational brick upon which they stack all the other bricks. Oh my God, what are they going to do next? Well, the judges are pretty clear. They said, listen, why don't you go do your environmental work like you should have? Why don't you go study it and figure this all out? Oh, by the way, you got an open thing out there looking to maybe revise your microwave radiation guideline. Yeah, you should probably look at that too while you're doing it. And so the FCC looked at it and scratched their head, and they went over to Ajit Pai, who's like a Harvard frat boy, and say, well, what do you want to do, Ajit? Do you think we should do the right thing and do the environmental work? Nope. What did Ajit Pai say? I think it's time to give our middle finger to those judges and act like a toddler and try to get away with it again. That's what we're going to do. We're going to try to get away with it a second time. So how do they do that? Well, they know they had that open order where they were supposed to revise or look at whether they should revise or not the microwave radiation guideline. And gee, no one caught on to the fact that this whole thing is based on SAR, specific absorption rate. And the paper, remember that paper I talked about from 1986? Yeah, that only looked at frequencies up to about 5,800 megahertz. Uh-oh. Do we have any SAR higher than 5,800 or 6,000 megahertz? We don't. Was anyone making a big deal with this? No, not yet. Boy, I hope they don't catch on. Okay, well, so we're sitting here, even here in the fall of 2019, with an old guideline that only applies to stuff up to 6,000 megahertz. And we're going to go ahead and do two things. Number one, that little revision of the guideline thing, yeah, not even going to look at it. It's not important. It's no big deal. We're just going to close it because we want to. So we'll close that. Oh, and the very next day, we're going to come out with another order. And that order is going to say, well, here's what we're going to do. That guideline that used to go to just 6,000 megahertz, we're going to extend that all the way up to 100,000 megahertz. What else are we going to do? Well, we can't really do good video and stuff at this low power level. So we're going to figure out a way to increase the peak to average ratio about 20 times. And we're going to write that in too. And we're going to write it in because that's what the wireless companies want. And we don't have to explain it. We just write it in because that's how it works at the FCC. And so they wrote that. And then they ran into Environmental Health Trust children's self-defense, and 20 plaintiffs who've been injured by microwave radiation way below the guideline, and they went to court. Well, that ruling came out on Friday the 13th, August 2021.
Oh.
This is a great ruling. This has to be seen within the context of the first ruling. The judges are very clear what the FCC should have done. Aug-2021 gave a middle finger to the judges and tried to get away with it. They got slapped a second time. This is the second major slap by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And they just wrote it out very clearly, quote, we grant the petitions. This is for the ruling from August 2021. Quote, we grant the petitions in part and remand to the commission. The commission failed to provide a reasoned explanation for its determination that its guidelines adequately protect against harmful effects of exposure to radio frequency radiation, end quote. That's pretty clear. That means you got to do something now. You got to figure out why your guideline's wrong. And guess what? That whole extension all the way up to 6,000 megahertz, up to 100,000 megahertz, yeah, that's no longer there. I'm sorry. We just remanded it back to you to fix it. Well, in the meantime, what's going to go on with all those cell towers that are already being installed that are broadcasting for something that has no guideline? We think we should power them all off while we wait for the FCC to do its environmental work. In fact, that would be the rational thing to do. And that is what we're asking our town to do. And I believe everybody should ask their town to do the same thing. Your town, when it issued its permit, gave us really two things: a construction permit and an operation permit. Hey, the construction permit might have met standards, they might have inspected it, it might have been okay. You don't have to necessarily pull that tower down necessarily, but what you can do is say you don't have the basis for an operational permit. That's what's changed now with this ruling. So you're going to have to shut it down until we hear back from the FCC. Then we can decide at what parameters we should operate those things in the future. Maybe we'll have to swap out some equipment. Maybe we'll have to reduce the power. Maybe we'll have to do smart things in order to uphold public safety and privacy and property values. But you can't just do the Wild Wild West and all the power that you ever wanted. Can't do that. Because we understand vertical, horizontal, and power. And if you just cut it down to the size of a Wi-Fi router with the power output of a Wi-Fi router, well, now we're getting in the ballpark. Now that's something that can work. But if you don't do that, you're just introducing a world of hurt for everybody.
Now, this is enormously important for every single person in virtually all of the inhabited North American continent and beyond.